The Devil's Crossing. In 1982, three high school friends were driving home from a Halloween party near the old Devil's Crossing Bridge in East Texas. The road was narrow and slick, hemmed in by thick, ancient oaks. They'd been warned about ghost sightings out there, but like most teenagers, they brushed off the tales as folklore. Around midnight, the car began to sputter, and the headlights flickered before dying out completely. Their first instinct was to get out and push the car, but as soon as they stepped onto the road, a freezing chill filled the air. One of them swears he saw fog rising up from the road in strange shapes, almost like skeletal hands reaching for their legs. And then came the sound, a deep, rumbling gallop that seemed to shake the earth itself. The three friends stood frozen, barely breathing. As they looked down the road, they saw him, a rider on horseback, wearing tattered old cavalry clothes. The horse was huge, jet black, its coat gleaming even in the faint moonlight. And the rider, he had no head. His broad shoulders led to an empty space, yet he sat upright, as if guided by some unseen force. They didn't wait to find out what the horseman wanted. Running back to the car, they somehow managed to restart it, and sped off in a cloud of dust and pure terror. When they got back to town, they found strange scorch marks on the hood of the car, and the smell of burning wood clung to them for days. The Phantom of Black River. The Black River Ranch, outside of San Marcos, has been in the Hill family for generations. Around the turn of the millennium, Old Man Hill told his grandkids about a night he encountered something unexplainable. He was out checking fences near the riverbank on a chilly autumn evening when his horse started acting strange, bucking and whinnying as though it had seen a predator. Hill tried to calm the animal, but soon he too felt an eerie prickling at the back of his neck. A strange, sour smell filled the air, like decaying leaves and something even worse, something burnt. The river water seemed to ripple, though the wind was still. Then he heard it, the unmistakable thudding of hooves on the dry earth. At first, he thought it might be some stray rider, but when he saw the shape in the distance, he felt his heart stop. There, moving through the mist, was a headless man riding a colossal, smoky horse. The figure stopped on the other side of the river, and Hill could see the outline of a rusted saber glinting at the rider's side. Hill's horse reared up, nearly throwing him, and bolted back toward the ranch. When Hill looked back, the headless rider was gone, but he would never forget the icy sensation that lingered, nor the feeling that he'd been watched. For years afterward, Hill forbade anyone from going near Black River after dark, convinced that the rider was a warning from beyond. The Sheriff's Midnight Patrol. Sheriff Ethan Ramirez had been patrolling small Texas towns for over a decade and didn't spook easily. But one October night, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. It was just before midnight when his radio started acting up. Static crackled, and a low voice mumbled something he couldn't make out. Just as he was about to turn back, his cruiser lost power, the engine sputtering to a dead halt. He stepped out into the inky night, armed only with a flashlight, and a strange silence settled over everything. He couldn't hear a single cricket, nor even the faintest rustling of the trees. The silence was so heavy it felt as if the very world was holding its breath. And then, from behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves, slow and rhythmic, echoing through the night. Swiveling, he shone his flashlight down the road, and his heart nearly stopped. There, coming into view, was a rider, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in what looked like old cavalry garb, torn and dirt-stained. The sheriff's beam passed over the rider's shoulders, expecting to meet a face, but there was nothing. Just the night sky where his head should be. The headless figure raised a hand as if in salute, and for one surreal moment, Sheriff Ramirez felt the man staring at him, though he had no eyes. Terrified, Ramirez stumbled back to his cruiser. But as he got in, the stench of something burning filled the cabin. The hair on his arms stood up as he watched the rider pass right through his vehicle, his phantom horse pawing the ground before galloping off into the night. The cruiser's engine roared back to life, but the sheriff sat there in a daze, too shaken to move. It said he left his job a few weeks later, claiming he'd seen something that didn't belong to the world of the living. The rancher's last ride. Not every encounter ends with the survivor. In 1967, old Jacob Wells, a rancher from Abilene, went missing during a stormy October night. His family searched every inch of his property, and authorities scoured the area for weeks, but Jacob was never found. However, strange reports came in from neighboring ranches. Some claimed they'd seen a lone horseman riding through the storm, headless and grim, his horse's hooves echoing through the thunder. 2 weeks after he disappeared, Jacob's horse returned to the ranch, but its rider was missing. When they found the horse's saddle, it was covered in muddy scorch marks, and the saddlebag smelled faintly of burned leather and charred wood. Some say Jacob met the Headless Horseman of Texas that night, and his spirit was taken as a price. Even now, on stormy October nights, folks around Abilene say you can see 2 riders galloping through the lightning-streaked sky. One, a ghostly cowboy with no head, and beside him, an unlucky rancher forever cursed to ride by his side. Midnight on Cattleman's Ridge. In 1979, Carl and Maggie Hughes were out late one night, checking on their cattle near the desolate ridge south of Kerrville. It was a particularly dry year, and they'd had problems with coyotes hunting down calves. Armed with a flashlight and Carl's old rifle, they rode their horses into the darkness, wary of any movement. As they climbed higher, the night grew unnaturally silent. Maggie thought she saw a shadow moving in the distance and signaled to Carl. But when they turned their flashlight toward it, they were met with an unsettling sight, a figure on horseback, standing perfectly still, as if watching them. The rider was massive, his body towering on the back of a monstrous black horse. He wore an old tattered coat, but it wasn't his clothes that caught their breath in their throats, it was the fact that the man had no head. Just an empty space above his shoulders, like he'd been cleaved by a giant blade. They didn't wait to see what he'd do. Carl urged their horses to turn around, and they galloped back down the ridge, the sound of pounding hooves following them. As they reached the bottom, they turned around, only to find that the rider had vanished. But the smell of burning wood filled the air, and when they got back to their ranch, they found that several of their cattle had gone missing without a trace. To this day, locals say the Headless Horseman roams Cattleman's Ridge, watching, waiting, and taking whatever he pleases. The Phantom Ride of Salt Flat Road. Salt Flat Road, winding through the desert near the Texas-New Mexico border, is a desolate stretch where few dare to go after dark. In 1986, a truck driver named Luke Navarro learned why. He was hauling a load through the Chihuahua Desert, eager to make it to the next town before his truck ran out of gas. The moon was high, casting eerie shadows across the barren landscape, when suddenly his truck started to shudder, the engine sputtering before it cut out entirely. Luke cursed, reaching for his flashlight, and stepped out to see if he could figure out what was wrong. That's when he noticed something strange. There was no sound. No wind, no animals, nothing but an uncanny stillness. Then, from the direction of the mountains, he heard it, a distant pounding, like the thunderous gallop of a horse. The sound grew closer, louder, until it was almost deafening. Luke squinted into the darkness and saw a figure racing toward him, a rider on horseback, with broad shoulders and a dark coat flapping in the wind. As he neared, Luke could see that the man had no head, just an empty neck and a phantom outline where his face should have been. Frozen in place, Luke could only watch as the Headless Horseman rode straight toward him. Just as the specter passed, the driver's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into total darkness. Luke says he felt the cold hand touch his shoulder, and the smell of smoke filled his nostrils as the ghostly horse raced past him and vanished into the desert. When his truck finally restarted, Luke floored it, not looking back once. He made it to the next town with his heart still pounding, but he left that road with something strange, 3 dark scorch marks on the side of his truck and a faint, burnt smell that lingered for weeks. The Haunting of the Pecos Ranch. The Pecos Ranch in West Texas has been in the Roberts family for over a century, and they've passed down a terrifying story from generation to generation. Legend has it that in the late 1800s, The original owner, Jed Roberts, encountered a headless rider on his land during a particularly brutal drought. Jed's herd was nearly wiped out, and his family was on the brink of losing everything. One night, desperate and half-mad from worry, Jed wandered out to his fields under a starless sky. He felt a strange chill and looked up to see a figure on horseback, watching him from the shadows. The rider was tall, his silhouette almost as wide as the horse itself. As he moved closer, Jed realized with horror that the man's head was missing, and yet, somehow, the rider seemed to know exactly where he was going. Falling to his knees, Jed begged the rider to spare his land. In return, he swore he'd never speak of the encounter. The Headless Horseman didn't respond, but the next morning, the rains came, and the drought ended. Jed kept his promise until his dying day, but his descendants say that the Headless Horseman still roams the ranch, a silent guardian. When he appears, it's always followed by a cold, uneasy feeling, and the smell of burned wood wafts through the air. To this day, ranch hands have reported seeing the dark, headless figure riding through the Pecos Ranch, his phantom steed gliding silently through the fields. Some say he's there to protect the ranch, while others believe he's there to claim the souls of those who don't belong. The Lost Souls of Bastrop Bayou. In 2004, a group of college students from Houston decided to go camping in the forests surrounding Bastrop Bayou. It was a crisp October night, and they'd heard ghost stories about the area, tales of spirits wandering the bayou, but they didn't take any of it seriously. Just after midnight, while gathered around the campfire, they heard what they thought was distant thunder. But the night was clear, and the sound grew louder, a steady, rhythmic pounding. One of the students looked up, eyes wide. "You hear that?" They all strained to listen, and that's when they saw him, a shadowy figure on horseback, moving slowly through the trees. The rider had no head, and his massive black horse seemed to glide above the ground, hooves never quite touching the earth. The closer he came, the more the smell of something burning filled the air, like charred wood mixed with rot. The students were paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the Headless Horseman circled their campsite. One of them managed to whisper a prayer, and that seemed to snap the group out of their daze. They bolted for their car, leaving everything behind. But as they sped away, they noticed dark scorch marks on their tents and supplies the next morning. Ever since that night, none of them have set foot in the Bastrop Bayou again. The legend goes that anyone who sees the Headless Horseman there will bear a mark, a reminder that they are trespassing on cursed land. And for those who linger too long, he might just take their heads to replace his own. The Hauntings of Dead Man's Pass. Dead Man's Pass is a rocky, narrow trail cutting through a canyon in West Texas, avoided by travelers for good reason. Legend has it that in the late 1800s, a group of Confederate soldiers tried to use it as a shortcut during the Civil War, but only one of them made it out. When he was found, he was babbling about a headless figure on horseback, chasing them through the pass. In 1997, a couple of college friends decided to explore the trail, brushing off the ghost stories as old folklore. As they hiked through the twisting canyon, they noticed an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you are being watched. Then came the hoofbeats, echoing off the canyon walls, growing louder with each passing second. They tried to convince themselves it was a trick of the wind, but when they turned the corner, they saw him, a towering rider on a dark, glistening horse, his head missing yet his body still and poised. The friends froze, watching in horror as the Headless Horseman turned his mount to face them, one skeletal hand gripping the reins, the other reaching out as if inviting them closer. The horse's eyes glowed red, piercing through the canyon's shadows. Without another word, the friends ran back to their car, leaving their backpacks and gear behind. To this day, one of them claims that the ghostly rider followed them all the way out of the canyon, his spectral hand reaching, claw-like, toward the back of their heads. Neither has been back to Dead Man's Pass since, but they warn everyone they meet, "Go there, and you may never leave." The Phantom Rider of Blood Creek Bridge. Blood Creek Bridge is an old wooden bridge near Nacogdoches that creaks underfoot, even without a breath of wind. In 2005, A young man named Eric was driving home after a late shift at the hospital. He'd taken a shortcut that led him over Blood Creek Bridge, a route he'd been warned to avoid at night. Just as he drove onto the bridge, his headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered, forcing him to pull over. He stepped out of his car to check the engine, but as he lifted the hood, he heard the distinct sound of hoofbeats on the old wooden planks behind him. Turning slowly, he saw a rider, a tall, menacing figure on horseback, illuminated only by the dim moonlight. The rider's clothes were ragged, his boots covered in dark stains, and where his head should have been, there was only empty air. Frozen in fear, Eric could only watch as the Headless Horseman rode toward him, his horse's hooves echoing on the wooden bridge. Just as the phantom passed him, the smell of burning wood filled his nostrils, and he felt an ice-cold chill run through his bones. When he looked down, he saw a thin line of ash on his hands, as if he'd been marked. He stumbled back to his car, started the engine, and sped away, his heart pounding. For weeks afterward, Eric found faint ashes on his clothes and hands, no matter how often he washed them. Locals say that anyone who encounters the Headless Horseman on Blood Creek Bridge is cursed to bear his mark, a reminder that some bridges are best left uncrossed. The Restless Guardian of Old Fort Griffin. Old Fort Griffin, a now abandoned military outpost near Albany, Texas, is a place filled with history, and not all of it peaceful. In the late 1800s, soldiers stationed there told stories of a headless horseman patrolling the land at night, a dark specter guarding the forgotten ruins. Some say he was a soldier who died violently defending the fort, while others believe he's the restless spirit of a Texas Ranger who lost his head in battle. In 2012, a historian named Sarah Murphy visited the fort to document the ruins. She was staying overnight, hoping to capture some photographs in the early dawn light. But around midnight, as she walked among the crumbling buildings, she felt a strange heaviness in the air, and an overpowering smell of smoke filled her nose. Turning, she saw him, a headless rider on a pitch-black horse, standing just yards away, half hidden by shadows. His uniform was torn and dusty, his boots worn, but he sat tall in the saddle, his empty neck seeming to watch her somehow. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah clutched her camera but couldn't bring herself to lift it. Instead, she whispered a shaky apology, backing away slowly. The horseman raised his hand as if to shoo her off, and then he disappeared, melting into the early morning mist. When Sarah developed her film later, she was horrified to find a faint image of the rider in one of the photos, his figure barely visible in the fog, but unmistakable. She hasn't set foot in Fort Griffin since, and warns all historians who ask, some places are guarded by spirits who never rest. The ghostly ride of the Brazos Valley. In the Brazos Valley, near the small town of Hearn, locals tell of a lone rancher who made a deal with the Headless Horseman in the 1930s. During a fierce drought, a rancher named Tom Harper had lost almost everything. Desperate, he rode out into the hills one dark night, looking for anything, signs of rain, a miracle, anything to save his land. As he rode, he came across a stranger on horseback, standing motionless in the shadows. The man wore the tattered clothes of an old cavalry officer, his coat torn and dirty, his boots caked with mud. But the most terrifying detail was his lack of a head. Harper, driven mad by desperation, pleaded with the figure to spare his ranch. In a voice that seemed to come from the air itself, the rider told him he could have rain, but he would pay for it in blood. Harper agreed, and sure enough, the rains came the very next day. But within a year, he lost his son in a riding accident, then his wife fell ill and never recovered. For every year he kept his ranch, he lost something, until he was left alone, watching over his land in silence. Some say Harper still haunts the Brazos Valley himself, cursed to walk his ranch forever, his family lost to the price he paid to the Headless Horseman. The final ride on Phantom Hollow Road. In the heart of the piney woods of East Texas, there's a stretch known as Phantom Hollow Road, a place even locals hesitate to visit after dark. In 2019, a teenager named Cassie drove her friends down the road as a dare. They'd heard the stories about the Headless Horseman, but like most people, They assumed they were nothing more than tales. As they drove deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and an eerie fog settled over the road. Then, out of nowhere, they heard it, hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, echoing in the distance. Cassie slowed the car, and in the dim glow of the headlights, they saw a shape moving through the mist, a dark, headless figure on horseback, riding alongside them at an unnaturally steady pace. Panic set in, and Cassie slammed on the gas, but no matter how fast they went, the rider kept pace, his skeletal hand outstretched toward the car. They heard a low, inhuman growl, and the stench of burnt wood filled the car. Just as they sped out of the fog and back into the clear night, the rider vanished, but a faint scorch mark, in the shape of a handprint, had burned into the back window. To this day, Cassie's friends swear they hear hoofbeats when they're alone at night, and the scent of burning wood haunts them whenever they pass by Phantom Hollow Road. They know now what the locals have always believed: once you've seen the Headless Horseman of Texas, he never truly lets you go. The final salute at Whispering Pines Cemetery. Just outside the small town of Jasper, nestled in the piney woods, there's an old, forgotten cemetery known as Whispering Pines. Legend has it that during the Civil War, a young Confederate soldier was beheaded in battle and buried there. In life, he was a loyal man who'd promised to guard the town. In death, he returned to fulfill that duty, riding as the headless protector of Whispering Pines Cemetery. In 2015, local historian and skeptic, Lucas Carter, decided to spend the night there on a dare. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a bottle of cheap whiskey, he settled down among the graves. For hours, the woods were silent, and Lucas began to think the ghost stories were nonsense. But just after midnight, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of hooves, pounding slowly at first, then faster. Lucas barely had time to react before a dark shape emerged from the shadows, a tall, broad-shouldered rider on a midnight black horse. The horse's eyes glowed a faint, unnatural red, and the rider's headless figure was still and silent, his tattered Confederate coat fluttering as he approached. Paralyzed with fear, Lucas watched as the Headless Horseman raised his arm in a final salute, then rode past him, disappearing into the shadows beyond the cemetery gates. When Lucas stumbled out of Whispering Pines the next morning, he found a strange, blackened handprint on his shoulder. To this day, he bears the mark, and he has never returned to the cemetery. The townsfolk say it's a mark of protection, but some claim it's a sign that the Headless Horseman has claimed him, body and soul. The Lonely Road to Devil's Fork. Devil's Fork is a desolate stretch of road cutting through a dry, rocky expanse near Del Rio, where travelers have reported eerie sightings for decades. In 1991, a ranch hand named Jesse was driving home after a long shift. The sun had long set, and he was alone on the dark, narrow road, exhausted but too uneasy to sleep. As he neared a hairpin turn, his truck's engine began to sputter, and his lights flickered before dying entirely. Frustrated, he climbed out of the truck, trying to get a look at the engine by flashlight. But as soon as he popped the hood, he heard it, the steady, chilling sound of hooves in the distance, growing closer. Before he could react, a rider appeared in the pale moonlight, a tall, headless figure on a ghostly white horse. The rider wore old-fashioned, dust-covered rancher's clothes, and his hands gripped the reins tightly as he rode closer. Jesse's flashlight flickered, and the light caught the faint outline of what looked like a rusty sickle hanging from the rider's belt. In a cold, shaking voice, Jesse whispered, "I don't mean no harm." But the rider paid him no mind. The horseman rode right up to him, stopping just feet away, and extended a skeletal hand toward him. The stench of smoke filled the air as Jesse stumbled back, tripping over a rock and landing in the dust. When he looked up again, the rider was gone, but the blackened handprint remained on the hood of his truck, a permanent reminder of the night he narrowly escaped Devil's Fork. Since then, Jesse refuses to take that road, and he tells anyone who will listen to avoid it after dark. Some say the Headless Horseman is the spirit of a rancher who died looking for his lost cattle, doomed to ride the lonely road forever. The Curse of the Brazos Bluff. The Brazos Bluff, overlooking a sharp bend in the Brazos River, is a scenic spot popular among local hikers. But come nightfall, the area takes on a different atmosphere. In the early 2000s, a group of college students from Baylor University decided to go camping there, unaware of the stories that locals still whisper about the bluff. The students were gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing ghost stories, when one of them noticed an odd shape at the top of the bluff. It was a dark silhouette, large and unmoving. Curious, the group watched it, laughing it off as a trick of the light. But when they heard the steady beat of hooves and saw the shape growing closer, their laughter died. Through the thick, low-hanging mist, the figure became clear, a tall man on horseback, his head missing, and a spectral glow around him. His horse was enormous, with fur as dark as the night itself, and its eyes glowed a bright, sickly red. The rider carried a long, rusted saber in one hand, and he rode slowly toward the group. In a panic, the students scrambled to gather their things, but one of them, Nick, froze, hypnotized by the rider's empty gaze. Just as the rider reached him, the saber swung through the air with a bone-chilling whoosh, slicing the darkness in half. Nick dropped his flashlight and ran, but when they reached the bottom of the bluff, they found a charred line across his jacket, as if the blade had nearly cut him. Since that night, Nick hasn't spoken of what he saw, and none of his friends ever returned to Brazos Bluff. Locals say the Headless Horseman guards the bluff, seeking the heads of those foolish enough to tread on his haunted ground. The Ghost of Lost Soul Prairie. Lost Soul Prairie, on the outskirts of Lubbock, is an eerie expanse of open grassland where cattle once roamed. Generations of ranchers have told stories of a headless rider wandering the fields on foggy nights, watching over the land he once claimed as his own. In 2008, Ben, a young rancher, was driving back from checking on a distant pasture when he saw a mist settling over Lost Soul Prairie. His headlights barely cut through the fog, and he felt a chill creeping into the cab of his truck. Then, in the distance, he saw a rider, a massive figure silhouetted against the moon, his headless outline clear in the mist. Ben's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to follow the figure, hoping it was nothing more than a trick of the light. But as he drew closer, he could see the figure's tattered, ghostly attire and his empty neck, pointing upward like a broken column. The horse's eyes gleamed red, and the scent of burnt leather filled the air. Suddenly, the horseman stopped, turning his faceless head toward Ben. For a heart-stopping moment, they stared at each other, and Ben felt a sense of dread he'd never known. The horseman raised a bony finger, pointing directly at him, and the mist thickened, enveloping the truck. Panicked, Ben reversed, speeding back to his ranch with the scent of smoke trailing behind him. To this day, Ben avoids the prairie at night. He believes the Headless Horseman was giving him a warning to leave Lost Soul Prairie alone, or else become part of the legend himself. The river crossing of El Muerto. The Rio Grande has its own tales of terror, but none is as chilling as the story of El Muerto, the Mexican outlaw who, according to legend, was beheaded by Texas Rangers in the 1800s and left to wander the borderlands forever. In 2017, a pair of campers, Alejandra and Marco, decided to brave the dense brush near the river, hoping for an adventure. They found more than they bargained for. As the night wore on, they heard hoofbeats approaching, loud and rhythmic. It was too dark to see clearly, but as they peered into the shadows, they saw a horse, a huge, powerful beast with a rider slumped over its back, a sombrero hanging from his neck. The rider had no head, yet he sat upright, guiding his horse with an eerie calm. Terrified, Alejandra and Marco ran back to their tent, but the sound of hooves followed them, growing louder until they thought their hearts would burst. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hoofbeats stopped. The next morning, they found the ground around their campsite covered in charred hoof prints, forming a circle around them. Locals say El Muerto still rides along the Rio Grande, looking for his lost head and any who dare to trespass on his cursed land. Some believe that the Headless Horseman of Texas and El Muerto are one and the same, a restless soul bound to the borderlands, forever haunted by the past. The Rancher's Last Ride. Not every encounter ends with a survivor. In 1967, old Jacob Wells, a rancher from Abilene, went missing during a stormy October night. His family searched every inch of his property, and authorities scoured the area for weeks, but Jacob was never found. However, strange reports came in from neighboring ranches. Some claimed they'd seen a lone horseman riding through the storm, headless and grim, his horse's hooves echoing through the thunder. 2 weeks after he disappeared, Jacob's horse returned to the ranch, but its rider was missing. When they found the horse's saddle, it was covered in muddy scorch marks, and the saddlebag smelled faintly of burned leather and charred wood. Some say Jacob met the Headless Horseman of Texas that night, and his spirit was taken as a price. Even now, on stormy October nights, folks around Abilene say you can see two riders gallop